A Reader by Li Jiatong, translated by Daniel J. Bauer. I am a loyal reader of Li Jiatong. I had always been a worker. I retired several years ago, and that's when I began to go to the library to borrow books. That's how I made the haphazard discovery of this author by the name of Li Jiatong. The reason I had always liked reading his essays was that in pretty much all he wrote, he seemed to talk for people in society who were vulnerable, like me, in one way or the other. From the time I began reading his writings, I discovered he was doing columns for the United Daily News. One day, I saw how he even wrote about ultraviolet rays. Maybe ultraviolet rays really could hurt people's health. But for someone like me, who had worked his entire life in the sun, well, why was it that no one showed any particular concern for us? I began to get increasingly curious about Li Jiatong. What did he look like? I got to talking with an official at the library, and he told me this Li fellow was a man of many words. It seemed his only fear was not having someone to talk to. He encouraged me to go see him. He helped me look up the telephone number for Providence University. I dialed that number for Providence and got transferred to the president's office. His secretary right away arranged an appointment for me. Well, Li Jiatong really was an easy man to talk with. I asked him about some things in those pages in his books, and he answered my questions happily enough. I saw he enjoyed relating directly with readers. It's probably true that visits by readers satisfy a writer's natural sense of vanity. While we were talking, a regular stream of people kept coming in. They all seemed to be officials of various university departments or units. I myself never imagined to make it into a university. I couldn't keep all those highfalutin folks and their titles straight. One of them was obviously a student. He came to discuss some kind of scholarly question. I couldn't understand a thing they were saying. One time, when the telephone rang and Li Jiatong took the call, he stayed on the line particularly long. I got to my feet and looked at his photographs. The bookcases and cabinets in Li's office were well stocked with picture frames. With the exception of one photo, a portrait of his whole family, the pictures were all of young people. Quite a few were of people in military uniforms. They probably were pictures of students who had served in the military as reserve officers. He had one picture in which everyone was young and dressed in military uniforms. They had probably all just gotten promoted. There in the midst of the whole bunch of them, my eyes spotted Li Jiatong. Oh, of course, he had changed completely. And no wonder, he was 60 years old now. He was only 22 back then. 40 years had zoomed by, and everybody changes when that happens. But I still picked him out. Li Jiatong was surprised when he found out I had recognized him as a young fellow. He said that lots of guests had dropped by over the years, but no one had ever picked him out in that picture. Every time he pointed out the picture to students, why, the students all said, "How could someone change so much?" There was only one student, a real brown-noser, who claimed he hadn't changed a bit. After talking like that, he got told off by Li Jiatong. You couldn't tell such a ridiculous lie and get away with it. I asked him if the ticket was a real story, and he told me it was fabricated. He said, "My mother came to see me" was real. I had read "My mother came to see me." At the time, it moved me. It was a story about a soldier who landed himself in a military prison in Xindian. He was always imagining his mother would come to visit him. Actually, the guy's family had cut all ties with him. Not a single relative ever came to visit him. Li Jiatong didn't know anything about the situation, and he went to see the prisoner's mother. Without realizing what he was doing, he brought that family together again. Later, that prisoner did get that visit from his mother. I asked Li Jiatong if the prisoner ever got back in touch with him. He said no, that had never happened. He had no idea why. I told him I once lived in Xindian and knew where the military prison was. We talked quite a bit about his motivation for writing. He finally asked how I had come. I said I'd taken the train along the coast to Shalu. He asked his chauffeur to drive me to Shalu. The chauffeur was a heavy-set young fellow, very good-humored. By the time I sat down on the train, I was ready to collapse. I had certainly never imagined he would look so old. I was that prisoner. When Li Jiatong came to see me back then, he was so young his hair was totally black. Now it was half white. I could still remember how he looked in his military uniform. He wore green in the winter and brown in the summer. When he became a civilian again, he quickly went to the United States. Before he got out of the army, he came to say goodbye to me. Although we saw each other, we could not shake hands because a window separated us. I recalled how just before he left me, he took the hat off his head and saluted me. My rank was private, and although a second lieutenant was the lowest ranking officer, he was still an officer. And an officer was not supposed to salute a buck private. And on top of that, there I was, a prisoner. I was startled by his mischievous gesture. But I sure could remember how he wore that hat. He had looked like a god to me. And now, I thought if he ever climbed onto a bus, someone would jump up and offer him their seat. Sadness was all I felt. How could he have become so old? All my memories of him were when he was young. I knew I should have prepared myself mentally. 40 years, well, we all change. I knew I had changed during that time too, and so he didn't recognize me at all. What I had never realized was I couldn't recognize him either. Why didn't I tell him who I was? The reason was simple. I didn't want to talk about my life. Everyone knows people in prison suffer, but why are there so few who see that after they come out, ex-cons meet all kinds of difficulties in adjusting to society? A brand on a man like that is a side effect you carry with you your whole life through. Li Jiatong could never know what it was like. It wasn't hard to find that in his writings. He had never done stories about what it is like for prisoners after they get their freedom back. Of course, had he recognized me, I'd have revealed who I was. But he obviously had not recognized me. I even brought one of his books for him to autograph for me. He asked me for my name, and I told him the truth. He wrote my name into my book, but his face was a blank. I felt exhausted. Once you become old, sometimes you shouldn't dwell on the past. That is especially true for a fellow like me. One thing not to do was beg for more pain and kill myself with old memories. I wanted to fall asleep. Oh, I felt tired. Then it dawned on me. The train was just pulling into Taipei Station, and I suddenly realized that when I recognized Li Jiatong, he should have been able to guess who I was. Who else would have been able to pick him out as a young man? He never asked me how I could know that was him. Clearly, it was because he knew I didn't want to tell him who I was. He had respected my way, so he didn't show anything. Then I said I had lived in Xindian, that I knew where that military prison was located, and still he didn't ask what I did for a living in Xindian. At that moment, he must have known without the slightest doubt who I was. When he said farewell to me in his office, he had lifted his hand to his forehead, and the gesture was a soldier's salute. I had hinted to him that I knew him earlier in life, and he had hinted back. Not only had he recognized me, he still remembered the scene of our last farewell. I went to see Li Jiatong to find an answer to a question. Had I changed? Now I finally had my answer. Although I did not recognize him, he hadn't changed at all.